Okay, so the first place to start when you are planning your podcast is to think about the podcast form. Podcasts have only been around for the last 16 years. They were invented in 2004. So the styles and shapes of podcasts are still in their early days, in their infancy. There's a lot of variety that can happen, but then again, there are still some fixed forms. You can be as creative as you like through sound, but there are a few tried and tested forms to check out before going your own way. So I'm going to outline for you the top forms here and then give you a bit of a good and bad about all of them, or the pros and cons. Number one, and probably one of the most common styles, is the interview. So that is where you would be interviewing a specialist in a given subject area. It's really helpful because it helps you to get new audiences. So the person you're interviewing might share your platform. It also allows you to have a lot of varied content because it's not just coming from your own mind, it's coming from different people. The hard thing is that it is relying on other people, so booking guests can be quite difficult. It relies on them to come up with the content as well as to make sure that they are giving you what you're looking for your content. Editing can also be difficult, especially in remote locations, as you would be at this point of your project. So I'll talk about that editing a little bit later. It's a little more complicated. It is doable, but it's just something to think about. So a good example, or one of my favorite examples of an interview podcast, is Jonathan Van Ness's podcast, Getting Curious. He has a question every week and he's interviewing a different specialist. So if you want to like a really good interview one, I would check that one out. Type 2, the solo podcast. I don't think this will be as relevant for you in call out, but it's worth considering that this is a very common style. So it's often about one person speaking to the microphone by themselves about their area of expertise. So you might get this style of podcast for someone who's really interested in talking about one particular book series or one particular game. It might be someone talking about finance, but they're talking about their one single subject by themselves. So the bonus to this is that it's super easy to edit and control. You don't have to rely on anyone else and it's just the one voice. It helps you to develop your personal brand. So if this is a podcast alongside your work in the real world, this would be a really helpful way of sharing your expertise. And it creates a really intimate audience connection because they are really understanding of your voice and your beliefs. The downside to this is having enough energy to bring it every single week or month or however often your podcast is, and creating new material can be a bit difficult. Another type, a really famous popular type, is the panel show. It should be the same as a television panel show. Often they're comedy based, so you have a series of people talking around a subject. This is really good because it's really interesting for an audience to hear different voices. So this might be something you want to consider in your project, given that you have lots of different voices within your group. It also takes off the content pressure from an individual and allows the conversation to flow a little bit more freely. But that being said, it then means that it's difficult to keep that content on track. So you will often end up with far too much material in a panel show than you want to fit into your episode time. Another type of podcast is the conversational or co-hosted podcast. That is Fluff. It's actually a fan favorite of podcasts. So it's the one that tends to get the most ratings, the one that tends to be listened to most frequently by podcast listeners. It is fun just by nature because it tends to be a more casual environment, a more honest environment, and it tends to be sort of the playing on the relationship between the two speakers. So you might notice that in Fluff. It also translates very well to a live show potential. So if in future, after this ends, Jess and I decide that we want to do a live show, it won't just be one of us standing on stage to talk. It would be the two of us able to create a podcast with an audience. It also shares the burden between two people. So the two of us can research different things, take on different roles, different people can edit, different people can take the lead on a certain week. So that's quite helpful. The difficulty is, again, then in editing. It's easy to, again, record too much material. And if you're in two different places, that editing process and the tech required for that is a little bit more difficult. Type 5, non-fiction storytelling. We might just call this news. There's a lot of news podcasts out there. Most news channels will have their news podcast. The one that I listen to every morning is The Guardian's podcast, Today in Focus. And you'll notice that it's not just news, it's not just headlines, it's non-fiction storytelling. So they often cover one story for half an hour and they follow that through all the way. It might include interviews, it might include a bit of research in the field. But it is one story, but in a non-fiction context. So there's quite a few to look at in that way. Obviously, if we have non-fiction, we then also have fiction podcasts. So there's a variety of versions of this. It can again be one voice, but it's more frequently a bit more like a radio drama. So for this, you want to think audio cinema over an audio book, because you're going to be creating the sound and the environment of a staged drama. Not just reading someone a story, because then we would turn to audiobooks for that. So that's more often the style when you come to a fiction podcast, and this might be something that would apply appropriately to your projects. And then 7 is a hybrid, and that would mean any combination of these elements. So as I said, Fluff is a co-hosted conversational podcast, but we do use elements of interview. We might follow a news story, bring that up. There's different opportunities for you to pick and choose the bits that you like out of all of these. Within the different styles of podcasts, the normal genre rules still exist. So you could still have documentary, comedy, drama, fantasy, self-help, true crime, sports, history, society and culture, kids and family under those subheadings. So it could be a conversational show that's comedy, or it could be a solo show that's about drama or documentary style. There's always still the subheadings that we apply to this type of media. Podcast style and your podcast style is dependent on your desired audience. So Fluff, we are aware that we will likely be appealing to a female identifying queer audience between the ages of 20 and 40. And this has been supported by our analytics when we look at who listens to our episode. That is primarily because that is the bracket that we fall into, and when we are talking about our life experience, the people that's going to speak to the most are the people who've had that experience. That doesn't mean we're limited to that, and we are trying very hard to access different audiences, but we need to be aware that that is our core audience, and we want to make sure that that serves them best. So this group might, for example, listen on a commute or at home, but are probably quite busy, probably have a career, might have children. So we want to make sure that when they listen to our podcasts, they are both entertained and that they learn something, and it feels like a just chill thing to do, listening with your friends. And so our goal is to make it feel like you're having a drink with friends in your kitchen or wherever you're listening. So when you want to think about what podcast you are making, you need to consider your audience before you pick a style at random. A task for you. So I would like you to go on to Apple Podcasts UK. You can do so on a computer or you can do so on your phone and see what is top 100 in the charts. Please pick one podcast that looks appealing to you. Listen to a section of it or all of it if you've got time. And identify this style. Why do you think this style works for this audience? And identify who you think the audience might be, where and when and how it might be listened to.